There is some resemblance of sadness to be had in a game series that has taken a wrong turn on its way forward into the next console generation. The stories that Bioware has told in these games, from Dragon Age Origins all the way up to Inquisition, have really been staples in the fantasy RPG genre over the past few years. Back in 2009, when Origins was first released, it was a standout in a genre that was just getting its footing in the Xbox 360 generation. I myself was a huge Bioware fan back in the day, playing every Dragon Age game since Origins, as well as the Mass Effect series, up until the dumpster fire that was Andromeda. Bioware has since fallen from grace since its generational run in the 2010s, but that isn't to say that all hope is lost. Now, is Veilguard able to compete with those that have come before? Well, if the internet has anything to say about it, my guess would be no. Just a glance at the Metacritic scores from both users and critics, and you can very quickly come to the conclusion that the series is dead, and this game is nothing more than DEI trash that is pandered towards the weirdos of the world. For the sake of my own sanity, and really yours, I will not be delving too deeply into that because at the end of the day, who cares? It's a game, and I don't really have the time in my life to say whether or not something so minimal in the story is game-breaking. Is it a little forced? Yeah, but it's not detrimental to how I look at the game. This is a game review, not a review of the mess BioWare has seemingly become in recent memory. They deserve it after what they did to Andromeda, but that is a subject for another day. On that note, let's get into the game itself. Now, this review is going to be as brief as possible in the sense that I'm going to try to cover as much content as possible in a cohesive fashion. I figured approaching it this way would allow me to cover as much of the positives and negatives without much room for the hiccups in between. And believe me when I say that there are a lot of hiccups. The game isn't inherently bad, and in fact I enjoyed myself quite a bit throughout my 40-hour playthrough, but there are some things that just feel out of place or lazy in their execution. The first major point I want to discuss is the story and the world attached to it. From a world standpoint, there are dozens of unique places that you'll battle your way through, with a host of different enemies that can vary from something as simple as a mercenary dressed in the most generic-looking armor as possible, to the many types of darkspawn that you'll encounter on your journey that are kind of a staple of Dragon Age as a whole at this point. They will have the standard archers and range soldiers, mages that wield a variety of elements, as well as the brute types that require more beating before they fall. I'll get more into the enemy types when I talk about the gameplay, so for now I'll shelf my thoughts on that. I will admit, from a world perspective, everything does feel unique and honestly beautiful in regards to how it looks. If there's one thing the game excels at, it's the locations that you visit throughout the journey. I'm talking about everything from haunted mansions, to ancient dwarven settlements built in the shadow of a long-dead titan, to grey warden castles that bear the scars of wars that came centuries before. It all feels very expansive in the way that it's connected by this new system the game has implemented called the Crossroads, which is essentially the host of the fast travel system. This is a central hub that connects all the areas together by these ancient mirrors that makes fast travel feel like more than just a convenient add-on. They make it so when you fast travel to each area, you don't spawn in a random place, but instead in front of a foggy mirror that looks like it hasn't been used in decades. It really adds to the fast travel feature by making it feel like more than just a convenience, as it really does make sense in the world that you're in. Then of course you also have the usual fast travel beacons in each area. They make travel mostly linear once you have reached a certain point. It makes it so there's no need to backtrack unless you're doing side quests or companion missions, which is quite convenient, I have to say. And I can't really say I have much to complain about as far as the world. Honestly, every location feels unique, and even though some of the cities feel kind of bland and repetitious in the way that they're creative and have this weird sense of verticality, at the same time, they feel just alive enough to where it isn't too immersion breaking. Even your main base, the lighthouse, has a certain feeling of calmness and serenity to it that I thought fit in with the mess that lied on the other side of the mirrors all around you. Overall, I don't think anyone will be disappointed with the world. The art style doesn't feel very Dragon Age-esque, but at the end of the day, at least it looks good in the execution, which is always a positive in the modern gaming landscape of buggy messes and other graphical errors. Everything, for the most part, looks very smooth, very perfect, but I will say it still does not feel the griminess of Dragon Age, but we'll get more into that in a second. So, from a story perspective, I will say that the main questline feels weak for the most part. There are a few sections that feel really good to play through and have a certain heaviness to the what is actually going on, but those are the ones that feel like a Dragon Age-esque quest. And anyone that's a fan of the series knows what I'm talking about. Quests that feel like what you're doing has a purpose and has weight to it. The problem with this is that more often than not, the quest lines that lead up to these big events are so brain-numbingly written that it feels like nothing is happening until these big events actually hit their peak. The story itself follows your ragtag group of local heroes as they essentially try to fix their mistakes from the first quest of the game. Who would have known unleashing 2 elven gods would cause the world more than a few issues? The main quest has you running all over the map for the most part, with quests that vary from missions as simple as find this missing person to murder every darkspawn in a preset area. There are a variety of quests you get to partake in, but I feel like the first quarter of the game is literally just where you get your companions and nothing else, which, there's 7 of them, so I guess it makes sense. Granted, from that point on, it opens up, but for the most part, the game is just gathering your allies with the sole effort of cleaning up the mess you made with the elven gods. The problem really starts when the writing tries too hard and ends up falling flat on its own face. Dragon Age as a whole is known for being pretty serious in the way its issues are presented, but this entry does not feel like that at all. The writing is goofy and tries too hard to sound cool and hip, and characters have the strangest reactions to the most serious of issues. Oh, the elven gods are invading the city one of our companions is from? Yeah, let's crack a witty one-liner before we make out we're there. It's also weird in the way that some of the writing seems to try too hard to explain things to you multiple times, as if your character has the memory of a goldfish. Now, I say this as nicely as possible, as the spot has been pretty much solely held by the second entry in the series for a really long time, but the game's story is the weakest it has been ever in the series. The stakes are there and presented to you as clear as day, but at the same time I didn't really care for it at the end of the game. It has its good points, but the lows killed the story for me more than anything. By the 35-hour mark, I just wanted to be done with it, honestly. I didn't really do too many side quests besides the companion ones, but even the ones I did felt shallow and not worth the time to complete, because the reward system in this game is super strange with its equipment and stuff like that. You don't just get base god tier equipment, you upgrade other equipment, besides just few exotics, of course. Pair this with the fact that the bad writing seems to follow you everywhere you go, and honestly, it makes everything outside the combat and world slump down to levels I've never seen in the series as a whole. The story itself really just felt, for the most part, it just felt really weak because the writing is bad. What's going on in the story is mostly uneventful, and the way that they kind of make you feel, or the writers make you feel as if you are just like a dummy and you can't handle the information in like a sneaky sort of way, so they just give it to you straight up. It just doesn't feel like Bioware, and honestly, at the end of the day, I think that is really what's going to kill it for a lot of people, especially people that are fans, is that the writing and everything else doesn't really stand up with how pretty the world looks and how like decent the combat can be at times. So now, for the sake of covering all my bases, I thought it would be appropriate to talk a little bit about the companions that you meet and add to your party as the story unfolds. This is more so just an add-on to the story section, but a game like this, you could argue that this is probably one of, if not the most important part. I'm going to start this off with a very sad statement, as it almost makes me feel like this is what they tried to replicate. This game's companions cannot compare to those that are in recent games like Baldur's Gate 3, or really any RPGs that come to mind. I would almost go so far as to say they don't compare to, with even the past entries from more than a decade prior. Most of the time, I would just pick the companions that go on missions with me that didn't annoy me with their dialogue, as opposed to the ones that seemed appropriate for my squad. Maybe it didn't matter, as I was a warrior, and honestly, as long as I picked DPS, I was always fine. But I always found myself leaning more towards those that just felt natural with how they bantered with each other, as opposed to how they synergized with each other, which is kind of super strange going back and reading over this now, because I feel like in a game like this you should focus on synergy, but we'll get to that more in a second. Some companions always seem to have something witty to say, while others were silent throughout entire missions. It really ties into my previous point about how everything feels weirdly generic, even with this host of cool people that are seemingly at your fingertips. You have one of each class at your disposal, from a dwarven archer, which is apparently a rogue, but I always thought she was just supposed to be an archer, to a dragon-slaying warrior, to a necromancer, and even an assassin who's possessed by a demonic entity. Sure, each one brings different abilities to the table, but more often than not, I found myself just relying on the same two for nearly every situation, regardless of who I had, my romantic interest in or anything like that. Pair this with the fact that I did every companion side quest to max out their skill trees, and I have to admit that most of the time I just found myself skipping through their dialogue, as their quest lines just didn't seem that interesting besides a certain few. I will admit that some felt really strong, with a really good payoff in the end, but others just seemed to like an add-on that didn't fit in with their past or seemed to add anything to the stories besides surpassing a bump in the road. While not as terrible as the internet has made it out to be, I will admit I didn't care for half of them just because their stories and dialogue didn't seem to match the tone of the story. Just for reference, I really like the stories of Neve, Emmerich, and Davrin, and felt the other stories were not as strong, even though they all had decent combat prowess, which I guess at the end of the day, maybe for a weak story, if they're good in combat, then hey, maybe you can look past that, and most of the time I did, but it's still a talking point that I think needs to be discussed. That, of course, leads into the one thing that people seem to hate or love the most, which is the combat system. Now, based on, Metacritic is just an echo chamber, and people go in there and give it zeros just cause, but the one thing on, the legitimate reviews that people seem to discuss and point out the most was either I love the combat or I despise the combat. Now, I will admit that I really enjoyed it for the most part. There really isn't much to say that hasn't been shown in 90% of the clips I used, but from a fun perspective, I think they did an okay job. For the most part, the combat system boils down to using your abilities to combo enemies in a way that makes it so you can apply as many buffs to yourselves while also debuffing the enemies around you. It's super basic and to the point, not to mention the menu allows you to select you and your companion's abilities, is honestly some of the most simple and easy to use that I've seen in a good amount of time. It allows you to select who you want your companions to target, as well as cast their abilities on. It's pretty... you can't mess it up. But when we get into the abilities themselves, I will say that there's a varied number of abilities for each companion, as well as yourself, but the selection isn't up to par with what most people probably expect from an RPG. And honestly, if you're expecting Baldur's Gate 3 levels of spells, where it's 20 spells, or Skyrim level spell selection, you're going to be really disappointed. And I mean, some spells apply debuffs and others just meant to do damage. So I mean, you have both pieces, but at the same time, it's a limited amount. With the selection of different classes you have on your team, from the mages to the rogues, there is a pretty decent balance between offensive and defensive spells, I will admit. Like I mentioned in my previous part about the companions, I found myself rotating between the same 3 or 4 people, while the other 3 were pretty much left in the dust, just because I didn't like the way their skills worked with mine. Honestly, I think there's a way in which any of the classes you have the option to play yourself can be enjoyable, just based on the fact that the gameplay really is just chug out as much DPS as possible. So, the only thing that kind of kills the combat is that most of the enemies are copy and pasted from the other enemy archetypes. If you start the game, you're 5 hours in, you see the enemies, you're going to see that same type of enemy 300 times throughout the campaign. I mean, some soldiers have a yellow bar that needs to be broken with your Y attack, while some mages have a magic shield that needs to be broken with your R2 attack. Once you've experienced one, you have experienced nearly every single enemy in the game. It's a very simple rock, paper, scissors system that definitely gets old quickly if you're fighting enemies even slightly above your level. There's a huge skill gap between oh, this enemy's 2 levels above me, yeah, they're going to take 3 times as much damage. Either way, I mean, everything feels super spongy, and sometimes fighting hordes of enemies can feel super overwhelming, even when you are in the late game, where you're supposed to be as overpowered as possible. This is why, above all else, I find myself just picking the companions that could do as much AoE damage as possible, with the shortest cooldowns. This led me to lean towards Neve and Emmerich more than anything, as they can put down as much damage as possible in a big area without sacrificing much time between cooldowns. It made otherwise miserable sections pretty tolerable, and I will say there are a lot of enjoyable parts of the combat if you can get past the beefy nature of some of the enemies. Overall, the combat was fun. I mean, nothing too bad, but also nothing extreme genre defining. We're not raising the bar, we're not lowering the bar. We are strictly hovering on okay, honestly. I think it's just perfect for what it is, though more active abilities would have been nice, as most of the huge skill tree, and I'm talking hundreds of points you can put into this skill tree, by the way, for everybody. It's just passive stuff. It's not even active abilities. I think there's 5 active abilities total you can have, maybe 6. I use the same ones that you had in the beginning, if that says anything. And most of the passives are just ability additions, such as more damage, or more stats effects, better defense, or yada yada. It's nothing super complex. It's super basic. I mean, overall, it made it more enjoyable, but for those that stray away from repetitious enemy types and spongy combat, you're gonna hate it for the most part. You're not gonna enjoy a second of it, and I mean that's a shame because there's a lot of possibility or a lot of potential in what we have here. But, Bioware decided to do something different. So when you bring all these things I discussed together, you really do get what I can only describe as an extremely disappointing entry in the Dragon Age series, but an overall, albeit generic fantasy game as a whole. Just that sentence in itself is probably going to ruin the game for a lot of hardcore fans of the series as a whole, as it really doesn't cater to what has made this Dragon Age unique over the past, 15 years of it since it's been around. Dragon Age has never been this clean-looking artistic marvel that this game is, and honestly, it's so weird to say that the roughness and like the bloodiness and like that feeling that the Dragon Age Origins and 2 and even a little bit of Inquisition sold is pretty much gone. All that's left is this picture-perfect ghost living in the shell of what was once a pretty staple series as a whole. And the worst part is, I feel like this game could have really been one of the better fantasy RPGs that's been released in the past few years. I mean, besides Baldur's Gate 3, there isn't really that many fantasy RPGs that off the top of my head kind of like, separate themselves from everything else. The foundation is there for the Dragon Age series as a whole, but somewhere along the way they must have lost their identity because the blueprint that, what it relies on has been changed way too much. Many of the reviews I've read tell the same story of how this game just doesn't feel like a true Dragon Age sequel. And while I enjoyed some parts, the parts that feel like Dragon Age games, I have to agree, as much as it pains me to say. Not to mention that this is a $70 game, fully priced out and selling for $70 in most places, unless you go on, GOG or something like that. And honestly, for that reason, I can't recommend it unless you're a hardcore fan of the series, or honestly, maybe a hardcore fantasy RPG fan as a whole. Like, I was able to get past most of it, but some people, as far as I can tell, just from reading around the internet, and you know how it's an echo chamber, some people weren't able to get past that bump. All I know is, at this point, my disappointment in what is to come is pretty much on par with what some of the people that gave it middling scores. It's definitely a 6 out of 10 without the Dragon Age name, but it's a 3 out of 4 Dragon Age game, which sucks. And honestly, I hope they take the community backlash and apply it towards the next entry, not entree, we're not eating, in the series, but I'm expecting the worst from Bioware going forward. And that pains me to say as someone who has been a fan of them for, honestly, as long as I can remember. Ever since I was, middle school, high school. So, on that note, if you enjoyed it, make sure to like and comment. I would really like to hear what other people think, but we'll see. To the 3 people that watched this video, thank you. I hope y'all have a great day.